Constructing a conclusion. Though some see the conclusion as a formality, it actually provides an excellent opportunity for you to summarize your key points and synthesize them in order to reinforce your argument. To help you do this effectively, we're going to go over some strategies that you can use to write an effective conclusion. An effective conclusion will typically feature 4 key components. An opening statement that calls your reader's attention back to the thesis or argument, a summary of the key evidence, a link that ties your evidence back to your thesis and demonstrates how the evidence supports your argument, and a closer or final thought that pushes the conversation forward. In this way, the conclusion mirrors the introduction in many ways. In addition, the evidence in the conclusion has already been outlined in your body paragraphs. Therefore, constructing the conclusion should be an easy task as long as you have the right framework to guide you. The opening statement serves 2 key purposes. First, it indicates that you're done introducing your evidence and signals that you are now wrapping up your argument. In addition, it calls attention back to the purpose of the essay. Things to avoid for your opening statement. Do not use the phrase "in conclusion" to begin. Although this is an effective transition that illustrates that you are concluding your argument, it is also an excessively common and even cliché approach. For example, when I was a graduate student, I would mark about 80 different papers each term, and approximately 60 of them would start with the phrase "in conclusion." Many of these papers were well written. However, they did not differentiate themselves from other students. Alternatives? Turn your opening statement into a rephrasing of your thesis. Your thesis is what makes your paper and your argument unique. By restating your thesis, you call attention back to your argument and signal that you are concluding your paper. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Perhaps you're a political science major and you've just finished writing a paper on how social media influences political discourse in America. Many of your peers might begin their conclusion with an opening statement that goes as follows. In conclusion, American political discourse is polarizing because of social media. This is relatively effective, however, it's cliché. Therefore, we want to avoid this. You want to differentiate yourself so that your paper stands out. In this case, you can rephrase your thesis or argument, and it might go as follows. An analysis of social media's engagement in politics demonstrates why American political discourse is so polarizing. Here, you signal to your reader that you're drawing their attention back to the argument, that you are done introducing evidence, and that you're now going to begin your conclusion. Let's take a look at another example. In this case, you are a human kinetics major, and you've just written a paper arguing that collegiate athletes should be paid. Your peers might begin their conclusion with an opening statement that goes as follows. In conclusion, the NCAA should pay athletes. Again, though relatively effective, this is cliché and it's not going to differentiate this paper from other students' papers. You want to begin with a restatement of your thesis. Based on an analysis of relevant factors, it is clear that the NCAA should pay college athletes. Again, you've called attention back to your argument, indicated to your reader you're done introducing your evidence, and that you are now going to summarize and synthesize that evidence. Let's take a look at one final example. In this case, you've been asked to write an essay as to whether or not teachers should include popular TV shows in their lessons. Your peers might begin their opening statement as follows. In summation, teachers can increase student engagement by integrating popular TV shows. Now, some students try to differentiate themselves slightly by using in summation in place of in conclusion. However, this reads in a very similar way and still comes across as cliché. Instead, restate your thesis. A review of current research suggests that teachers can increase student engagement by integrating popular TV shows into their lessons. You've again signaled to your reader that you're calling attention back to your core argument, implying that you are done introducing evidence and that you will now summarize and synthesize to show how your evidence supports your argument. Once we've written an effective opening statement, we're going to move on to our key points. In this context, there are three things we want to keep in mind. First, we are obviously going to restate our evidence. Second, we are going to organize it in the same sequence that it was presented throughout the paper. In this way, the conclusion is very similar to the introduction. However, the third point is what differentiates the two. In the conclusion, you can now point to specific details that you outlined throughout your essay, which you would not have mentioned in your introduction. Let us take a look at a couple of examples to see how this works. The introduction versus the conclusion. To demonstrate how these two differ, we're going to take a look at that hypothetical NCAA paper. In order to argue that college athletes should be paid, we've outlined three key pieces of evidence: the revenue that the NCAA generates, the fact that players risk their health, and the ethical considerations. In the introduction, we want to outline all three of these, but we don't go into specific detail. For example, we might first write, the NCAA generates significant revenue through sport and should share the profits. In the conclusion, though, we want to demonstrate that we've proven this. So we might add, for example, Texas A&M generates over $193 million annually, and 23 other schools generate over $100 million each. The next piece of evidence: in addition, athletes risk their health and future earnings. Again, in the introduction, we will leave it at that, but in the conclusion, we want to demonstrate that we've proven this. For instance, Stanley Doherty suffered a career-ending spinal injury, and Tyrone Prothrow's tibia and fibula were shattered and never fully healed. Finally, we might say, lastly, it is unethical to not pay people for their labor. In the conclusion, we would add, unpaid labor undermines the value of work, and not all students can afford to work for free, which privileges some students. Here you can see that we've outlined each key piece of evidence that we're going to discuss in the intro, but in the conclusion, we've added the specific details that we've brought up throughout the paper. Let's compare and contrast the differences between introductions and conclusions with one more example. You've written an essay on popular culture, arguing it belongs in academia because it simplifies complex concepts, promotes student engagement, and facilitates critical literacy skills. Your introduction will go over all three of these, but it will not provide specific details. For example, popular culture can help simplify complex academic concepts. That's sufficient for your introduction, but throughout your paper you've introduced evidence that you can now draw on in your conclusion to reinforce that you've proven your argument. Using analogies from popular TV shows can help to explain complex theories. You might even be more specific. For example, one instructor used a specific TV show to outline a specific theory. You would, of course, name the specific show and theory in that case. This would not be included in the introduction. It would simply move on to pop culture can also increase student engagement. In your conclusion, you want to reinforce that claim with evidence or examples. For example, students are often more eager to talk about the films and music they love than academic topics. Again, this wouldn't be included in the intro. The intro would pass over from one piece of evidence, the increased student engagement, to the next. Using popular culture in class can enhance critical literacy skills. But again, in the conclusion, you want to prove that you have demonstrated this. Teaching students how media content shapes information allows them to be a critically engaged audience rather than passive participants. In this way, the intro and conclusion differ because the intro simply alludes to the broad topics or evidence you'll be discussing, whereas the conclusion draws on that specific evidence and data that you've introduced throughout the paper to prove that you have demonstrated and validated your argument. Once we've outlined our key topics and the evidence that support our claims, we want to link all of this to the conclusion. This means that we have to show how the evidence supports our thesis. Let's take a look at how we can achieve this. Let's go back to our NCAA paper. After we've summarized the evidence, we then want to synthesize it. Given these ethical considerations, as well as the fact that the NCAA profits from the work of athletes, while athletes risk their health and future earnings, it is clear that the NCAA should pay their athletes. In this way, we synthesize all three pieces of evidence and link it back to the argument, showing how our evidence supports our argument. Let's use the hypothetical pop culture and academia essay as another example. Once we've outlined our evidence, we want to synthesize it. Pop culture can simplify complex ideas, increase engagement, and improve critical literacy, thereby enhancing student outcomes. Thus, it should be included in academia. Here again, we have synthesized all three pieces of evidence, brought them together, and showed how they benefit students and how they support your argument. Once the evidence has been summarized, synthesized, and linked to the argument, most people assume that the conclusion is done. However, there's one more piece of the conclusion that we need to include, the closer. We want to leave the reader with a final thought to consider so that they can see the importance of your argument in future practice and application. When creating a closer, there are many options that you can choose from. However, there are three common ones that prove particularly effective in most situations. 1. Future research. 2. Application. And 3. Benefits. Let's take a look at how each of these work in practice. Let's assume that you've written a paper that demonstrates the negative impact of marijuana among adolescents. When constructing your closer, you might draw on future research. Given that marijuana is more accessible since being legalized, future research should investigate its usage and impact among adolescents. Throughout your paper, you may have made arguments, but now your reader has an idea of what needs to be done going forward and can see the importance of what you've demonstrated. Suggesting future research might also serve as an effective closer for a paper about pop culture in academia. After demonstrating the potential value of including popular culture in the classroom, you might go on to write a closer that goes something like this. To determine the merits of pop culture in academia, future comparative studies could examine the effectiveness of specific approaches. Throughout your paper, you prove that pop culture in a broad sense can support learning, but you might not have outlined specific strategies. This suggested future research would give the reader some direction that they can go in order to establish a specific framework or guideline for including popular culture in the classroom. After arguing that collegiate athletes should be paid, we might create a closer that draws on future application to give some direction to the new policy we've suggested. For example, we might write, moving forward, the NCAA should develop a policy that would allow players to receive remuneration while supporting their studies. In this case, you highlight some potential concerns with the new policy, but give the reader a sense of the direction that it can go in. After outlining an argument that demonstrates the value of visual learning tools in the classroom, you could use applications as an effective closer. For example, you might write, given the value of visual learning approaches, teachers must consider how they can implement this tool in their classrooms. After seeing the value of this approach that you've proven throughout the paper, you're now encouraging the reader to reflect on this themselves and consider how they can apply it in their own practice. This allows them to make a connection between your argument and their practice in the classroom. When considering a specific position or argument, readers often consider how the argument can benefit them. Thus, outlining benefits can likewise be an effective closer. Perhaps you've just written a paper that argues that index funds are better than mutual funds. Your closer might sound something like this. Building a portfolio with index funds could increase one's retirement savings significantly. Now the reader sees the direct benefit that they're going to receive from following through with the argument that you've outlined. Perhaps you've written a paper about the merits of getting a library card. In this context, outlining the benefits as a closer would be particularly advantageous. In addition to relaxing with a good book and expanding your mind, you may even meet some new and interesting people while at the library. In this way, you call attention back to the benefits of following through with your argument and even add some additional benefits that the reader may not have considered. Special note: do not add any new information or evidence in your conclusion. Any evidence that was central to proving your argument should have been introduced in the body paragraphs and should have been accompanied by effective and thorough analysis. If you introduce new evidence in your conclusion, it may confuse your reader or leave them with the impression that you are disorganized and do not know how to prioritize your information. For this reason, you only want to introduce evidence that you've already outlined throughout your paper. So let's do a quick summary. We'll begin with our opening statement. This calls the reader's attention back to our argument, signals that we are done introducing information and ready to conclude. This will be followed by a summary or outline of our evidence. Unlike the introduction, which will only allude to the evidence we're going to discuss, we'll accompany that evidence with specific details that validates our positions. We're then going to link all that evidence back to our thesis through a synthesis of that information, and then we're going to finish with a closer or final thought that pushes the conversation forward and shows the reader its value in future practice or application. Now it's time for some final thoughts. First, avoid beginning your conclusion with "in conclusion" or even "in summation." These phrases are used excessively and come across as cliché. You want your paper to stand out. Your thesis makes you unique. So restate your thesis in new words, rephrase it, and show your reader that you're calling their attention back to your argument and what makes your paper unique. Second, when you're sequencing the evidence, put it in the same order it appears in your paper. So as you summarize, keep it consistent with the order that you would have had in the intro and the order of your body paragraphs. This shows that you're organized and consistent. Third, synthesize your evidence as you link it to the thesis. Show that all of your evidence is working together. Fourth, conclude with a final thought that pushes your argument forward. Most people believe that once they've synthesized and summarized the evidence and shown or demonstrated how it supports their argument, they're done. But you want to show the reader the potential future application so that they see the value of your argument. And finally, we do not want to introduce any new evidence in the conclusion. If it was important enough to be in the conclusion, it should have been discussed thoroughly and analyzed in your body paragraphs. Now that you have a clear framework, you should be able to write an effective conclusion. If you're not sure if you understand it or if you need some help, don't hesitate to book an appointment with the Writing Support Desk through My Success. We're happy to help you out and take you through this as a step-by-step process. But be sure to book early because our appointments fill up quickly. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.